I feel like we missed a lot in the time that we were away from each other, but we're gonna spend a few minutes kind of just checking in, talking about some housekeeping stuff initially, and then I want to kind of look back on some of the stuff that you guys should have covered independently while we were away, and then we'll jump into today's content. So I would love it if you all could help me today and kind of talk either out loud or using the chat feature to sort of help review some of the things that you should have read, watched, etc. On your own. And thank you all for the questions and comments in the chat. I appreciate it. If you heard, I am feeling much better, thank goodness, but it was a long time coming. Okay, so let's start with some sort of announcements and things like that. I have decided to nix the final. Okay, so you will not have a final for this class. I'm going to revise the syllabus and get an updated version of that posted. I just don't love the online testing. And so why waste our time, right? Your final grade then will be comprised. So it'll be like a little bit, fewer points involved because we're taking that 100 off the table. So you want to make sure that you've got your asynchronous work done and kept up with, especially from now until the end, because attendance and participation comes from that. And your written reflections will be sort of your last grade for this class. So like I said, everyone did really well on the, most everyone did really well on the midterm version of those. And so that will essentially be your final, is those 5 written pieces, okay? I did get some questions, a question via email about page numbers and the last topic. So I wanted to just share really quickly. I have the textbook open and I'm not sure if it was because there are 2 excerpts on this page that maybe it was confusing. But I will say too, I tried to look at this for this particular student from my phone, and I could not get it to the correct page. So I'm recommending using a laptop or desktop. A computer seems to get you to the right page. I don't know, for whatever reason. But I did cross-check today. So the pages listed here on this document is posted. It's embedded in the link where you would submit your written reflections 6 through 10. So this section due at the final, the page numbers do align with the electronic text. And this last one, transition to long-term care, is a reading. And so it's directly under here, under this culture and diversity one. It says personal choices. Should I put my parents, aging parents, in a long-term care facility? That is the section that you read. And it gives you some considerations like level of care needed, temperament of the parent, etc. So you'll read about all of those things, and then your reflection would be written about that for that final one. Okay. And that's in line with everything else we've done so far. But like I said, for whatever reason, there was some confusion about page numbers. So I wanted to mention that. So I think no final, focus on your written reflections. Hopefully you've started those. You should be working towards the midpoint of those right now. Are there any questions or concerns or things that people want to get off their chest before we get into content?
When does that paper due?
Reading day.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
Sure.
I had a question.
Sure.
So on my last one, it was I got like doc points for in-text citations. Do you want quotes or do you want us to like cite the textbook?
Yeah, so and I'm glad you asked that, Brayden. Whenever you refer in academic writing, whenever you refer back to an idea that is not originally yours and it's coming from a text, you should cite in parentheses the author of the text. And if you're using APA, it would be the author and the year of publication. MLA, I'm a little bit less familiar with. It might be author and page number. And so whatever, we're all from a variety of disciplines. I've always used APA. So like I said, I don't even know MLA. But you can quickly Google search, APA citations or MLA citations, whatever discipline you're in, uses, whatever is most common for your discipline, is okay with me. And I have to Google MLA to make sure that they're done correctly when people turn that in, but I'm okay with that. So in-text citation should be parentheses, right? After a statement that refers back to the book, you would say for our case in APA, it would be Knox, 2020. And then you need a reference list where you cite the entire text, right? And you can, again, Google how to do that. And someone did email me with a specific question about that. I will respond to you. And I do apologize for that. I've completely dropped the ball on life for the last 2 weeks. Like, I did not get out of bed for 2 weeks. So I have a lot of catching up to do myself. And I will respond to you if you've reached out to me. And I think someone else in this class wanted to have a quick meeting. Again, I will get back to you on that. And I apologize for my lapse in communication and such. So Braden, hopefully I answered your question. If not, shoot me an email. And if you have, specific needs, but the information for finding how to create citations and references is pretty straightforward online. OWL Purdue is a great website where it's always correct. The library online probably has some resources. And then I saw a hand raised, Annalyn. Yeah.
Hey, yeah, I did have a question about that because I got points docked for that as well. I used sources that didn't have authors, and I went on to OWL Purdue, and it says that if there's no author, that you just use the title and your signal phrase or the first word or two of the title in the parentheses. So I was wondering why I got docked off points. If you wanted to talk after class, that would be cool.
Yeah, let's do that if you'll stay on the call for me. Okay.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Sure. Anybody else? Questions about any of this?
For MLA, it's typically the author's last name and the page number for MLA formatting for in-text citations.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for that. Sorry, I'm answering a question. All right, so I am basically going to go back to the course page, and I just kind of want to roll through things we didn't touch on together, right? So going back a couple of weeks to week 11 is where we sort of left off. That week, you guys asynchronously were to look at a resource on sexual satisfaction. And then the content that we would have covered together was about sexuality in relationships, right? I'm not going to take a whole lot of time on this, but I want to make sure I hit the highlights of things missed. So some key kind of terms or ideas from this chapter in particular have to do with sexual value systems, I guess is the best language to use, right? So the text talks about sexual values as being moral guidelines that sort of determine, not always, but give us a framework for making choices about our sexual behavior, right? And it's important to know, and I sort of stopped myself because it's important to know that just because we hold a certain value system in place doesn't mean that we always act in line with that value system, right? So some people, and the text goes through these pretty clearly, some people have a value system that is termed absolutism. Oftentimes this is associated with religious affiliations, but it is basically the notion that sex is morally right or wrong, either moral or immoral. And often these people make the decision to not engage in sexual behaviors until the point of marriage, right? That's an absolutist view of sex behavior. I think of these three terms as kind of existing on a spectrum. So you have absolutism over here, no sex until marriage. I'm going to jump ahead to hedonism, which is to me at the opposite end of the spectrum. And this is where sex is more of a casual thing. People who are, willing and consenting to engaging in sex behavior that is not serious, not necessarily monogamous, kind of, again, at the sort of polar end of the spectrum from absolutist view of sex. I think it's important to point out that casual sex was negatively associated with psychological well-being. So in research, the more casual sex a person has, the lower their self-esteem, life satisfaction, and sort of sense of self tend to be, okay? So that's food for thought, right? And then somewhere in the middle of that spectrum is a relativism, a view of sex from a more relativistic standpoint. And this is really kind of in general, this is the value system, again, from research that the majority of college students like yourself held, right? And it's not absolutist and it's not hedonistic. It's that middle ground where really the decision to engage in sex behaviors with a partner depends upon a variety of factors, including emotional connectedness, trust, respect, etc. Right? So instead of making our decisions based on this sort of all or none view, we take a more middle of the road ground and really make decisions based on relationship factors. So be, aware of those three kind of approaches, value systems related to sex. And then what I wanted to hear back from you guys is, what did you get? I had a recording posted, or you could have, gleaned it from the PowerPoint right here. But in terms of the sexual double standard, if we were in a meeting, we would have been in breakout rooms to discuss this. But some of you, if you're willing to chat and or talk about this, what was the sexual double standard that was brought out?
For the sexual double standard, I think this is definitely like, it's something I've really known before too. And it was a repeated thing, I think, in most every situation. It's where like the guy, if they do something, like if they're sexually active and they're more sexually active, they're like, oh, they get high-fived and they get applaud for it. And they're like, oh, great job, like you got that. And then like if a girl does the same thing, like people will call it like a slut or something, and they'll like shame them for doing it. And I've heard this before in like, for example, like this right here where it's like stud versus slut. And then I've also heard there's like a, what's it called? I guess I don't know like what it would be called. I guess an analogy where it was like, if you have a lock and a key, and if you have a lock that can be unlocked by many keys, then it's a lousy lock. But if you have a key that can be unlocked, that can unlock multiple locks, it's a great key. And the key being the guy, and then the girl being the lock. And I've seen that a lot, which is really, it's really frustrating. And I don't understand the whole point of it, because I like the only difference between a man and a woman, besides like, obviously there's more than one, but the biggest difference, one has a penis and one doesn't. So I don't get why women get shamed so much for it when it's not that, like, it's not that serious.
Right. Yes. And so that's kind of it in a nutshell, right? It's interesting. The last time I taught this class, someone shared that exact same lock and key analogy. So yeah, I think, the gist of it is that, and this is a generalization, from a sort of societal standpoint, right? But the gist is that women tend to be sort of chastised, looked down upon. The behavior is not socially normed or accepted for women in the same way that sexual promiscuity, is sort of celebrated for men in our culture. And again, it's a stereotype and a generalization, but that is what is meant by the sexual double standard. And so it's like that sex behavior is accepted and encouraged on the part of men and not so much on the part of women. And it doesn't make sense, and it isn't equitable, and all of the things that have been said here, right? Any other thoughts, or anybody have something to add to that?
That third bullet there, just like perception of female virginity is seen as a gift. I definitely see that. Like, I definitely feel like when a girl loses her virginity, it's more like the guy is like proud of himself for taking it, if that makes sense, which virginity in itself is just like a social construct that's made to make women like feel like they need to like hold a specific standard anyways. But I just find it like, yeah, that's it.
Yeah. Yeah. And the text has a lot to say about that whole idea of, virginity and the sort of social construct around it. Why is it so important? And again, that's kind of related back to those sexual moral values and things like that. But yes, I think, and again, I want to be careful, because a lot of what we're talking about right here is really just with regard to heterosexual sort of normative, traditional relationships. Doesn't necessarily apply to everyone, but I do think that from a societal standpoint, there is this viewpoint, and it does play into our relationships with one another, from when sex behavior starts until I don't think this ever goes away, even for women like widows, it can show back up because this perception of women as not having permission to engage in sex behaviors as freely as men is definitely a thing. The recording will be posted. Theron, sorry about your emergency. Yes. Okay, so I think that's kind of what I wanted to, and my notes down here, if you saw those, some ways that we might see this sexual double standard sort of at play in people's experience, right, is we might see women faking orgasms, participating in sex that they don't necessarily want to engage in. Sexual assault can be a factor here. Sometimes tolerating pain during sex, and prioritizing a partner's pleasure over one's own. Those are all ways that we can sort of see this sexual double standard show up for people kind of in real life. And so I wanted to just sort of make sure to say those things in case you didn't see them. And Zoe, yes, what you just said is that it's sort of celebrated for men to sleep around and frowned upon for women. Anybody else before we move on? So the rest of this chapter talks about sexual tempo. that is essentially the length of time a couple waits before they decide to begin having sex as partners. So your sexual tempo kind of, sets the pace for sex in the relationship. And then there's some interesting information in the textbook about like essentially what happens in every sex relationship is that there's this peak during the first year where sex behaviors kind of increase, and then they plateau, and then they tend to taper off, right? So that's like a normal part of a long-term relationship, and that's kind of important to know, so that you're not like, what's going on here? There's actually a psychological term for it. People refer to that as satiation, kind of the same thing as like you've eaten, until you're full. And so that is a factor that, can influence the sexual pace of your relationship once you've been with a partner for a number of months. All right. And I think awareness is kind of, the first step in working through that, right? Because sex is a healthy part of relationships. So week 12, the content was about planning for parenthood. So making decisions about when to have children, how many children to have, all of those, am I going to have biological children, adoption? Those are kind of the big ideas from that chapter. I wanted to just like reinforce, because I read most of your ideas on the infertility discussion were similar and related. So we are all in agreement that most of the contributing factors for the United States birth rates decline have to do with careers being prioritized over families, right? And we've talked about this at the beginning of the class. People are waiting until later in life to get married. Women are working outside of the home more than they did in the past. And so those tend to be factors that are kind of bringing that number of, it was like 2.1 children per family or whatever, that number is declining. The video that you watched also talks a lot about the pandemic and how that has influenced people's decision to have or not to have young children. Can you guys share with me, either again, chat or out loud, there were lots of ideas actually brought out in the discussion about why that is. So why is the pandemic influencing people to not have children?
I think probably the biggest thing that is the pandemic did, like make people feel that way, is the amount of time you had to be enclosed and like with your child, like the entire time, 24/7. I was a sister in the time, so I saw how like my stepmom was affected, and she was so stressed out and she was so ready to get back to work. And like, if I was someone who wasn't a mother that saw that and like thought that was what living with a child was like, I wouldn't want one myself. And it's really bad because they go crazy and then you have no time apart and there's no like you time, and just bad first impression.
Yes. So, and lots of things kind of come out of what Brighton was just sharing. First and foremost, childcare in the United States, I don't think that people really realize what a fundamental element of our like societal infrastructure early childhood education was and is in this country until COVID happened and it went away, right? When people didn't have a place to take their children during the day, that in and of itself, like really undermines your ability to work outside the home, right? So that's kind of key. And then, as Brighton was sharing, people are isolated in their homes with young children, lacking social support, lacking opportunities to get out of the home and do things for oneself or with other adults. Lots of layers to all of that, but I think all of those things certainly played a part. And then I don't know if you guys know, so in the early childhood realm, and that's really my background, we talk about the childcare trifecta, which is like a 3-pronged situation that creates a crisis related to childcare in our society, right? The first is that childcare in and of itself is underfunded. So childcare centers cannot, like, they're not self-supporting. They are not a money-making endeavor. And then the second corner of that is that because of this issue that childcare centers can't essentially pay themselves well, they can't hire and maintain high quality staff, high quality teaching staff, right? So teacher turnover, lack of quality, all of those things are very important. And then the third corner of that is that this leaves the onus on parents to pay for childcare out of pocket, and parents in our society cannot afford to do that and to pay for living wages for teachers and high quality, right? So there's this, again, it's like a never ending cycle of issue related to childcare. And I think COVID brought a lot of that to light, and, you know, kind of exacerbated a lot of that, because access to high quality childcare is one of our biggest challenges in America anyway. And then, you know, that, like, what people did have access to essentially went away. It is hard times to raise children in this world. And, you know, from a financial standpoint, very few families can afford to not have a parent working outside the home. So it just really is an equation that doesn't add up. And that's going to play into, I think, what you would have looked at for last week with the work-family balance, or maybe that was just yesterday or Monday on the asynchronous, the video about work-family balance. But there's no such thing, you know. That's the unfortunate truth in our reality in America in 2022, is that it's becoming increasingly hard to support a family, to have a family, and to sort of, I don't believe you can balance the two, but like she suggests, try to have them kind of exist in harmony together. It's a lot. Thoughts on this? Anybody have anything to share? I see things coming in the chat. I need to take a minute to kind of catch up. Yeah, the economy, Zoe, thank you for bringing that up. That's, you know, it's hard to feed a family of 4 in this economy. It costs a lot of money to buy groceries. And then, yeah, economy, I think, is the other thing that is being brought out in the chat that we hadn't necessarily said out loud. So, all right. So before you got into work family relationship stuff for the first of this week, there was a bit on violence and abuse in relationships. I would have taught on that, but we also didn't meet last week. So maybe I have the PowerPoint open. No. There's a visual in the PowerPoint that shows, I'm just going to touch on, damn it, this cycle of abuse, because that's essentially what happens in abusive relationships, is that it's this sort of cyclical thing that keeps people locked in, right? Has anyone watched the miniseries on Netflix called Maid? MAID. Yeah, I'm not here to make television recommendations, but what I will say is that I think that miniseries does a great job of kind of showing what the cycle of abuse looks like in a relationship. Yeah, it's very good, very sad, traumatic in a lot of ways, but it is telling in that there's very clear abuse in the relationship, but it takes a while for you to really notice that it is actually abuse that's happening. Because again, so this cycle that I think you can see on the screen right now, right? The cycle looks like tensions build, right? So there are undercurrents of, you know, like sarcasm, sometimes it's even just banter in relationships that is hurtful, you know. It's usually verbal, emotional at this point, but there's just sort of an undercurrent. I think of it too, you know, you probably have heard this analogy of, like, you put the frog in the pot of boiling water and the frog hops out, right? It's like, nope, not doing this. But if you put a frog in a pot of warm water and slowly let the temperature rise until boiling, the frog doesn't realize what has happened and it, stays in the boiling water. So it's kind of that same idea, right? You don't realize when this tension is building that, you're essentially getting to boiling point. Boiling point is where the incident occurs, right? So there's an incident of overt physical, verbal, or emotional abuse. Again, this can look like intimidation. Sometimes it's even just heavy breathing that is intended to, incite fear in the other person. But there's an incident of abuse, and then there's this reconciliation period. Reconciliation is the abuser comes back to the victim, tries to make amends, promises this will never happen again, I'm going to change, yada, yada, yada. And then there's always this period of calm where the incident goes away. We go back to being lovers, and, not quarrelers. And that period can be very, very long sometimes. And so it sort of sneaks up on the person again when tensions start to rise. And again, there's another incident. From a psychological standpoint, if anybody has a background in psychology, this is about reinforcement, right? Patterns of reinforcement. And so if a behavior is always reinforced, like if every time I said something to my partner, they responded with an abusive comment or abusive behavior, I would clearly very quickly learn when I engage with this person, they abuse me, right? But because intermittent reinforcement, which is reinforcement patterns that are erratic and don't happen every time, those are actually the hardest to learn. So if I behave this way and my partner is loving and responsive and nurturing and whatever, and that's what I learned to expect. And then once in a while, when I engage with my partner, they're abusive, it's harder for my brain to actually like create that connection and to learn to expect that behavior. So there's a lot of actual psychology and things that go into people getting trapped in these cycles of abuse and staying in, toxic relationships for long periods of time. Someone says, I learned in a social psych class that people are less likely to stop a behavior that increases at a slow rate because it's hard to know when it is enough. And again, that's that analogy of the frog in the pot, right? If you jumped in and you knew the water was too hot, you would get out. But if you jump in and it's just like, cool, we're chilling for a long, long time, and then all of a sudden I'm burning and boiling, and I can't get out. Yes, that's definitely a factor. And so hopefully you all read the article that was posted about the cycle of abuse. And I think it's really important. It really just unpacks most of what I just said related to that cycle. But it also goes on to say that the cycle isn't necessarily the most effective way to kind of understand these patterns because of these reasons, right? The cycle centers on women being abused by men, which is not always the case. Women can be abusers in relationships as well. The cycle of abuse can lead to victim blaming. So, when we as people outside the relationship understand the patterns of behavior that are creating that dynamic, it can sort of give us space to make judgments about people's experience in their relationship. And that's not necessarily useful or helpful to people in abusive relationships. And then again, like it suggests that you might be able to predict when these types of things are going to happen and make changes to your behavior. So they suggest an alternative, which is called the power and control wheel, right? And maybe you've seen this, but it really looks at how people in relationships might use things like finances, coercion and threats, intimidation. Children can be used to abuse. by way of making a person feel guilty about, you know, being with or not being with their children, using children as middlemen to communicate in a relationship. That is like a huge pet peeve of mine for some reason. Mostly probably because I think it's so detrimental to the child. Threatening to take children away from one another. Isolation is a way that people might use power and control in a relationship. So essentially power and control, you know, there's all these different ways to assert power and try to assert control in a relationship, and that can ultimately lead to acts of violence. So this might be the most relative way to look at this issue nowadays. And then this is something that I want to share because I think it's important, and it's related to this issue. And it is about rape culture, and how this can, you know, be a factor. This can certainly be a factor in abuse and violence in relationships. Okay. I came across this, I think just like on Instagram or something, but I thought, you know, I think this is the kind of thing that needs to be shared because it's like the frog in the pot analogy, right? It doesn't start with rape necessarily. It starts with these things at the foundation of the pyramid, sexist attitudes, you know, jokes in poor form, wolf whistles, catcalling, another huge pet peeve of mine. Like people, women in particular, or men, people deserve to go out and, you know, go for a run in a sports bra and not be commented on, right? Or not be noticed, not be catcalled, because again, that is a behavior that is another person asserting power or control in a sexual way, unwanted, right? Unwanted non-sexual touch. But anyways, I think just take a glance at these behaviors and think about how they're sort of benign at the bottom. They feel benign, but ultimately, this is how, you know, tolerance of the behaviors at the bottom of the pyramid is how the things at the top of the pyramid sort of begin to happen for individuals. No problem. Anybody have anything to share here about any of this stuff? Right. I think we're caught up to speed. So today, hopefully you have watched the video on work-family balance. Someone I think asked a question in the chat. There is no asynchronous work for this week, but I do really, really encourage you to watch that video because I think it's so important. And again, it's essentially someone, you know, saying what I said before, is that there's no such thing as work-family balance. And then she gives 5 or 6 recommendations at the end of the video about how to functionally do life as an adult in this society with a family. And I think those are really important. And I will say, just anecdotally, I lived my life for about 10 years recently, where I really felt like, looking back on it now, I feel like I sold my soul, you know, like I was doing the deal. I was working 50 plus hours a week. And my quality of life over the course of the decade, it really, really, really started to suffer. My mental health started to suffer, my spiritual and emotional health. I was just a mess. Until I did, her second recommendation is to pause and sort of reassess, like, is this working for me in this moment in time? And for me, COVID was a factor. There were a lot of things, you know, at play, but the answer was no, absolutely not. Like, this is not working for me. And so my husband and I had to make some hard life choices and really take a step back and figure out, what are our priorities? How are we going to work towards those? And, you know, my life is totally different now than it was 2 years ago. And it's because I could not strike that balance. And things were the wheels were falling off. So I would just say, before you get to that point, again, being aware of the issues, I think as you're moving into that phase of life is important, to give you tools, you know. All right. So this week, today, we are talking about diversity in parenting and some choices around parenthood. Not so much what you looked at before in terms of choices to have children and how and what that might look like. This is about actually once you have them. Okay. So we're going to just talk about different parenting choices. We'll talk about that transition in life from not having children to parenthood. Explain some different theories of child rearing, and then I really want to kind of focus on effective parenting because I think that's important. All right. So basically, parenting in and of itself is just this series of constant choices and decisions, right? We are choosing to convey a message, either to reinforce or not reinforce the child's behavior, even if we don't take any action, right? So any action or non-action on the part of a parent can essentially be a parent making a choice that communicates something to the child. If I choose to ignore my child's tantrum, you know, or even if I don't consciously choose to ignore a tantrum, if I just ignore it because I'm busy cooking dinner, that communicates something to my child. And in the same way, stopping to, you know, get down on their level, speak with them about what's going on, or pick them up and move them to a different location. All of those things are in the moment decisions that are happening all the time for parents, right? So that's what's meant by indecision is a decision, right? So me not taking action is actually me taking action. Trade-offs. Parenting involves trade-offs, you know, so kind of in the example or like my little spiel about my life before, me working 50 plus hours a week, the trade-off there, right, was I'm going to have a decent income, but I have absolutely no time at home with my children. So I have to decide, do I want to give up the income to have, you know, time at home with my children or not? Can I even do that? You know, that's the type of trade-offs that are involved. Sometimes you might make decisions about sending a child to school when they've just turned 5 rather than waiting until they're 6. You know, you have to weigh the pros and cons. Is this a good decision for the child? If so, why? It's a trade-off, right? The text talks about reframing. This exercise of reframing is really something that can apply to like any circumstance in your life, right? Is that rather than being regretful of something that you didn't do the way you wanted or that didn't pan out as you had hoped, it's a learning opportunity, right? You take what didn't work well and then learn from it and sort of shift behavior for the future. Obviously, parenting is heavily influenced by culture and society. You know, our discussion earlier about how is COVID and the pandemic impacting the decision to even become parents or not, right? That's a clear example of how culture and society influence parenting. I think technology, there's so many examples I could give. Could someone tell me what is an ACE?
Adverse childhood experience.
Thanks, Josh. Yeah, it's an adverse childhood experience. And so there's a ton of research emerging about ACEs in the past, I don't know, maybe 10 or 15 years. It's become kind of a hot topic issue, but parenting in and of itself, we would hope would be a protective mechanism from adverse childhood experiences, right? Obviously, that's not the case for all children because it depends on the parents, but parents can be a protective factor, first and foremost, if they're aware of what are adverse childhood experiences, like violence in the home, divorce of a parent, substance abuse, those kinds of things, and how then do I protect my child from being exposed to those circumstances, right? The good enough parent, it's an idea brought out in the textbook that and I love this phrase, good enough is good enough, right? There's no perfect parenting, there's no perfect anything. And so you take what you can get and do the best you can, and that is enough as long as you're doing your best. The 7 basic choices. Those are whether or not to have a child, how many children to have, how many years are going to be spaced among your children, what method of discipline a person will use, the degree of time one will invest in their children, whether or not to co-parent, and how that will all look and feel, and then technology exposure. So again, that thread of technology, is a factor again that shows up in parenting choices. But that's what the text defines as the 7 basic choices for children. So it's all related to how many and how often you're going to have children, and then discipline, whether or not you will, sorry. Maybe that was an accident, whether or not to co-parent, and then technology use with children.
Party animal, a literal party animal.
If everybody will check their mute real quick, it would be wonderful. So the 4 basic C's then are also important, and these are talked about in your text as care related to emotional and physical well-being, consistency. Children, especially young children, thrive on consistency, and they need consistency and predictability in their environments. Choices. Children need to be given choices so that they can feel a sense of autonomy and control over their own experience. And then consequences. I don't love that word, but it's like the alliteration or whatever of the 4 C's. But essentially, the fact of life, right, is that our behaviors generate outcomes. I prefer the terms outcomes maybe, but it feels less, punitive. Consequences to me sounds like punishment, but children do need to understand that if I choose A, this is going to happen. If I do B, this is what might happen, so care, consistency, giving them choices, and then helping them understand consequences of life. Already talked about the choices. Okay, so this is where we're going to talk about the transition to parenthood. There's a term actually given to this phase of life for women in particular who are going to become mothers. It's called matrescence, 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 and it's compared to adolescence in your textbook. So it's this actual physiological shift that's happening for women in this transition to motherhood, right? It's a mental body hormonal shift that marks a transition from one phase of development to another. And it's important to know that that's happening when it's happening, because it's like a lot happening all at once for a woman, transitioning into motherhood. Not to say that fathers don't have a shared experience, with exception of the hormonal piece, right? But there's certainly a transition for men moving into fatherhood too. A lot of what we see happening for men is related to some of the gender ideology stuff that we've talked about already. So men can often find themselves kind of caught between these old ideas of, what is masculine, what is fatherhood, and then more, ideas that are more on trend today, that those gender ideologies are sort of a thing of the past, right? And that there is necessarily no traditional way to be a father or way to be a parent. And so that can be kind of tricky for men transitioning to fatherhood. Also, men experience postpartum depression. It's not as widely recognized as female PPD, but 5 to 10% of new fathers report symptoms of this phenomenon, right? Because your entire life is in upheaval and transition, whether for the good or the bad. It can generate a lot of emotions and feelings for both partners in the parenthood equation. And then, you know, when we talked at the very beginning of class, we talked about the lifespan development framework, right? This is one of those markers in that development of the family where we're shifting from a couple to, you know, a family with more people and more personalities and more kind of stuff going on. So it's a big transition for folks. There are a number of parental roles discussed in the text. So first and foremost, parents are protectors and caregivers, right? The job is protect children from harm outside of the home, inside of the home, and then managing kind of basic safety. It's everything from don't touch the hot stove to stranger danger to, you know, dressing for the weather. That is first and foremost the parent's role, protector and caregiver. Parents also serve as an emotional resource to young children. So they, you know, create a safe space for children to learn how to make mistakes, how to suffer consequences, how to navigate social situations outside of the family and outside of the home. Parents do that work all the time with young children. And hopefully, I say young children because ideally you have to do that sort of less and less as the child grows, you know, especially if you do it well when they're young. Parents are teachers. Parents are the first teacher. It's, you know, again, everything from teaching letters and numbers to teaching family values to teaching cultural practices. All of that stuff goes into parenting and teaching, and it's often done in overt ways. Like when I say teaching letters and numbers, most people, you know, do something like intentional to sort of communicate that to children. It can also be covert or not overt, right? Where we're communicating about our family values and our cultural practices without necessarily teaching that. It just happens by exposure and experience. Parents are obviously the economic resource for their children, right? We have to provide for children cost of basic care and enrichment activities. Parents are health promoters. So it's, you know, promoting healthy habits in the home, managing risks so that children are not exposed to things they shouldn't be exposed to, providing healthcare and access to healthcare. All of that stuff goes into this idea of health promotions. And then ritual bearer. So this is kind of related to what I said before about conveying culture to children. It can be, you know, saying a blessing before your meal, and it might be a blessing or a prayer that's handed down from generations. Friday nights, movie nights, game nights, you know, creating holiday traditions, those kind of rituals and traditions inside the home that create a sense of belonging as a family unit. That is all related to this idea of ritual bearing. Anybody have anything to share related to any of those roles or questions? All right, so overparenting is exactly what it sounds like. It's like the idea of helicopter parenting, right? So you're micromanaging, kind of over involved in the child's experience. Because again, children, you know, they need to be given choices so that they develop a sense of control and autonomy over their own experience. That can't happen if another person is always managing the experience, right? So there's a balance, and it again there should be more parenting happening in the early years, and then it hopefully will taper off so that people have the opportunity to kind of fail forward and learn their way through life. It's important to understand that there's not one singular influence on a child's development, right? So even if you have a parent in the home who has a very negative parenting style, and even if that's the only parent in the home, right, the child is exposed to outside socialization at some point. So children, they do not exist in a vacuum, and they do not just exist within a home. There are tons of influences and things that contribute to their developmental trajectory. And then each child is kind of their own player in this circumstance, right? So even if I parent, which you can't, because all children are different and they don't respond the same way to the same parenting techniques, but even if I did the exact same thing every single time for both my children, they would still turn out differently because they're different humans, right? I want to talk about the different parenting styles. Is anybody familiar with authoritarian, authoritative, permissive, and uninvolved or neglectful? Okay, so those are the 4 key parenting types. Authoritarian parents are essentially, it's again sort of that idea of a spectrum. They're the my way or the highway. You do it because I said so. I'm going to give you something to cry about. That's the kind of vibe there, right? Authoritarian. Uninvolved is exactly what it sounds like. They are so uninvolved that they don't do a lot of parenting. And then permissive, I like to think of permissive as kind of the opposite end of the spectrum from authoritarian, where they are go with the flow, you do you, I'm just here to kind of, whatever, be here, let you do your thing, right? And that is a permissive parenting style. There's a lot of research on outcomes for both of these, and kind of, again, middle of the road is what we call authoritative parenting, which is a balance of those two, right? So it's creating expectations for children to align with, but not demanding that children, do it a certain way, or and it's often, I think sometimes the difference is just explaining your rationale. It's not because I said so, it's because it's a safety concern, or it's because later on down the road, these are skills you might need. It's like, really, I think of it as just a respectful way of parenting children, so that you're treating them as autonomous human beings who are having their own experience, and you're supporting that, right? So it's a balance of the two. And just as a note, the most positive outcomes for children come from authoritative parenting, not from authoritarian or permissive, and certainly not from uninvolved, but authoritative, that middle ground. This is just kind of a infographic about positive parenting and what that looks like. So there's a huge push in society right now for positive parenting approaches. There's a program out there through the health department in most communities called Positive Parenting, P, Positive Parenting, I don't know, Positive Parenting Program, I think that's what it's called. But anyways, it's all about this kind of general idea, right? That individual time with children, connection with children is key. Praising specific actions. So a lot of times it's about verbally reinforcing, what you want to see more of, you invest your attention and your time on, rather than trying to bribe children or give them stickers or candies or whatever, and that relates back to connection. When they feel like they're in relationship with you, they want to do things that, sort of please you and make you feel proud and make them feel proud in turn. Parenting is super stressful. It's like, I am about to have a doctoral degree in early childhood education, and sometimes I look around my house like, what are we actually doing here, y'all? I have no idea. As much as you can know intellectually, it can really kind of all go out the window when you're parenting your own children 24/7. And it's just so hard, but super rewarding. And you've got to reframe and kind of focus on what you can do, right? And that is not control your children. You can never control children. You can never control other people. You can just show up the way you want to show up and then hope for the best. But often, you know, just keeping my own self in check and regulating my own emotions, that is communicating to my children. Sometimes I'll literally just walk in and like both my girls are fighting with each other and there's so much chaos, and I'll just be like, just a second, got to take a deep breath. There's like so much happening in here, you know, and I will literally put my hand on my chest and take a couple deep breaths. And then like I move forward with whatever needs to be done. But my hope is that, you know, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, when my children are having an interaction with a partner or whatever, and it's not going well, right, that they can mentally hear me say, just a second, lots going on here, need to take a minute and like take some deep breaths, you know? So I model the kind of thing that I want them to be doing. And it really comes back to keeping myself regulated so that I can hopefully, you know, help them do the same thing. Consistent age appropriate outcomes, consequences, guidelines, expectations for behavior, those have to be in place in a home with positive parenting. It just is a non-negotiable, and children thrive on that. They need that. And then again, positive interactions to correct problematic behavior. So it's a lot of talking. It's sometimes waiting until the situation has diffused and settled before, you know, people can't hear you in the throes of all the emotionality. I've learned that over time with my husband, right? Like if we're both emotional about an issue, we cannot communicate about it effectively. If we just table it and say, you know, can we come back to this in a week or so and sit down and have a conversation where we both bring talking points to the table. And I do the same thing with my kids because they can't hear you when they're emotional. I don't believe that timeouts work. I think that, again, mistakes, all behavior is communication, right? And mistakes are communicating to me, you're either lacking a skill set or you're lacking some of your needs being met. You need for me to help support you in some way, and sitting you in a chair and telling you to think about life or whatever doesn't support you in learning. And then working towards balance of parental need and child need. So again, this is kind of related to that idea of work-family balance. It's just so hard to balance all the people in a home and all the things going on. But, you know, acknowledging, and this was brought out in our discussion of COVID and how it has impacted people's desire to have children, right? You gotta have parent time that is just for grownups. And I sometimes say to my children, as much as I love being your mom, I also love being a wife, and we are going out together tonight without you. Peace, have fun, you know? And it's okay because we have to do that as well as doing what we need to do with them and for them. So, but that's like working towards that idea of balance. The only thing, I mean, this is all pretty obvious, I think, but effective parenting doesn't stop when children aren't young anymore, right? Teenagers have to have involved parents. And again, that balance of not over parenting, but still being involved. And I think if you create the relational foundation early on, the hope is that, you know, the relationship will continue into the teenagers. Of course, it will shift and change, but teenagers need parents too. And then all of these kind of technology issues that they start way before teenage years. Trust me when I tell you, you know, they start when kids are born, really, I think now. But managing screen time, monitoring cell phone usage, all of that stuff becomes increasingly important as children age and develop. There's a whole bit on sex education, whether or not that should be, you know, in the realm of school and government, but I certainly think that providing sex education in the home is non-negotiable. If it doesn't happen there and it doesn't happen elsewhere, you know, it happens on the playing field, and that's not where we want it to happen. We want people to be informed going into, situations where they're going to be having to make sexual decisions. So that has to come, I think, from effective parenting. And then teenagers are adolescents are tricky individuals. They require a creative approach to parenting that maybe you didn't have to employ early on. Single parenting is kind of its own whole thing. I literally, God bless all the single parents. I cannot imagine that has to be, because again, it's like, it just layers this whole element of like, you don't have a person to help. You don't have a buffer in the home, there's no partner to kind of tap in, tap out, or someone to talk about it with after it happens. So lots of issues kind of just related to single parenting as its own challenge. But you can read about those at the end of the chapter. And it can certainly be done well. It's just, it's going to have challenges that dual parent households might not face necessarily. All right. I'm exhausted. That was a lot of content in a short amount of time, but we're caught up and everybody knows where we're going from here, right? Let me just make sure I say this out loud. Next week, we're asynchronous all week because it's Thanksgiving and I know people want to probably travel on Wednesday. I myself will be traveling. So you have content posted to review on your own for next week. And then we will have our final class meeting on Wednesday, November 30th. You don't have any more asynchronous work after next week. So for the final week, there's nothing to worry about asynchronously. We will meet to discuss families in later life and issues related to that phase of life. And then I'll send y'all on your way. All right. Don't forget that your written reflections are due on reading day, so be working towards those. And I'm available electronically if you need me before I see you again. I hope you all enjoy turkey and food. Yeah, and chat your names before you hop off. I will catch up on all of the attendance and grading and all of that stuff. That's my plan for the upcoming week or so. Annalyn, were you planning to stay on with me anyway, or did you have another question?
Yeah, I was just raising my hand because I had some questions about the Insight.
Okay.
Station.
Yep. I will be here. All right, okay, thanks, Ella. I don't know, Annalyn, if Becca is on. I'm gonna create, nope, okay, she's gone. So no need for breakout. We're here. And let me